Good morning. Today we will look at the poem The Sea and the Skylark by Gerald Manley Hopkins. This poem is prescribed for the students of BA Part 3, English Literature, Paper 1. First, a look at the biography of Gerald Manley Hopkins. Although the English author and Jesuit Gerald Manley Hopkins, who was born in the year 1844 and died in 1889, wrote more than 40 mature poems, he is regarded as one of the major English poets. G.M. Hopkins was born at Stratford, Essex, on July 28, 1844, into a talented family which encouraged his artistic nature. In 1854, he entered Highgate School, where he distinguished himself as a gifted student and began to write Keatsian nature poetry. At the age of 19, he entered Balliol College, Oxford University. Hopkins' undergraduate letters, notebooks and sketchbooks reveal his intelligence, sensitivity and sensuous response to natural beauty. Yet he was physically delicate and revealed an aesthetic tendency, a strong-willed desire to curb his passionate and egotistic spirit. In 1864, Hopkins was deeply moved by his reading of John Henry Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua, which carefully detailed the reasons of his conversion to Catholicism. On October 21, 1866, Newman himself received Hopkins into the Roman Catholic Church. Once Hopkins became a Catholic, his need to control his sensuousness and individualism led him steadily toward the most ascetic mode of life he could choose. By January 1868, he had resolved to become a priest, meaning he had decided or determined to become a priest, and on September 7th, he entered Manresa House, a Jesuit novitiate near London. In January 1884, he was elected to the chair of Greek at University College Dublin. He taught there until he died of typhoid fever after a long period of ill health on June 8, 1889. G.M. Hopkins can be replaced by none in realms of Victorian poetry. Hopkins was a typical Victorian poet and is included in the anthologies of both the Victorian and the modern poets. His was a converted Catholic priest and Jesuit priest. His poetry was indeed an organic and internal collaboration of the priest and poet in him. He is interpreted by most poets that his poetry is a synthesis of old and modern. His poems was published posthumously by his friend and contemporary poet Robert Bridges under the title Poems of Gerald Manley Hopkins. Hopkins was a religious poet who saw God's glory in the beauty and splendor of nature. Thus one can see this in The Sea and the Skylark. First, there is the text of the poem, The Sea and the Skylark. Some of the word meanings are, the word trench in line 2 means to make a deep impression on. The phrase describing a moon growing and shrinking is wax means to grow and wane means to shrink. To wend is to wander aimlessly, which would not describe the movement of the moon. Hopkins spent 3 years at St. Bruno's College, Trimacion, and whilst there, he was sent to Ryle for 5 days for the good of his health. In the book Gerard Manley Hopkins in Wales, Norman White writes, "It is not the ideal place for Hopkins to relax in, and with nothing to do but twiddle his thumbs, he, not surprisingly, produced yet another poem contrasting the permanent grandeur and fresh beauty of nature's phenomena with the sordidness of the moon, the sea, and the skylark." White goes on, unfortunately, walking on dry sands without means of escape from the petty architecture and shrill tourist vulgarities. Hopkins' disgust was evoked. So Ryle had its detractors in the 19th century. The poem contains the line, "How these two shame this shallow and frail town." In the sea and the skylark, we see a sudden loss of hope concerning the restorative potential of humanity. Instead of seeing nature as a forum for the masses to gain an understanding similar to his own, Hopkins suddenly creates a sense of complete isolation from the rest of the mortal world, as he considers what is essentially their self-inflicted downfall. His manner of doing this, however, is still located very specifically within the natural world, as he literally plays nature and man off one another, and through this illustrates his belief that humanity is failing in the sight of God. Indeed, as a work concerned with the disappointment of human potential, The Sea and the Skylark is sobering, both through its effective use of a simple, comparative style and stark inversion of the process of mankind's creation. The first line of the poem clearly sets the context and motivation of the work, as the narrator introduces the idea that we are not only dealing with the effects of two different sounds, but also that they are significantly too old to end, giving an immediate sense both of their timelessness and the reverence they are due. Reverence means deep respect. He then moves simply to distinguish between them, as the first stanza is concerned with the sound to his right, namely the sea, and the second deals with that to his left, a skylark. We are struck both by the immediate appeal they produce through the emphatic use of compound language typical of Hopkins' style. To quote the line "in crisp of curl of wild winch whirl," line 7, and by the significant sense of permanence he equates with them when he says, frequenting there while moon shall wear and wend, in line 4, alluding back to the feeling that they are simply too old to end. And this contrasts with the image of humanity presented in the final two stanzas. How these two shame this shallow and frail town, how ring right out our sordid turbid time, being pure. These are lines 9 to 11 in the poem. In contrast with the permanent and powerful sound of the bird and the sea, the town nearby for Hopkins is shallow and frail, illustrating the transitory and insignificant nature of civilization. Indeed, the sounds of nature literally shame mankind because of their purity, and this completely overpowers the sordid town nearby. It is true that sordid and turbid are perhaps over emphatic in their expression of negativity concerning civilization, as we see in line 10. But they arguably indicate Hopkins' desire to illustrate not only how shameful mankind is in relation to nature, but also how far it has fallen from its rightful position within the natural world. We, life's pride and cared for crown, says line 11, where God created mankind as literally the crowning glory of his world, the rulers over both animal and plant. The poet now appreciates that this situation and power is no longer afforded to a humanity that has lost that cheer and charm of earth's past prime. Line 12, that has been reduced to a level far below both the sea and the skylark, to whom the poet turns for relief. This time, the poet is placed apart from the rest of humanity, and there is significantly no sense that a restoration to God might bring him closer to his kind once more. Instead, the final stanza illustrates the complete regression of mankind back to inanimate matter or slime, mentioned in line 14, inverting the natural process of evolution suggested in line 11 and echoing the Christian belief in the creation of man. Our make and making break are breaking down to man's last dust, drain fast forward towards man's first slime, line 13 and 14. Through this reference to the creation story, it is arguable that in the context of the failings of society and alienation from God, Hopkins alludes to the first fall of mankind in the Garden of Eden. Of course, the sins of Adam and Eve were accounted for by the birth and death of Christ, but significantly, no comfort such as is given at the end of the poem. Unlike the final line of God's grandeur, there is no hope for the moral enhancement of mankind through a potential realization of the interest of God in nature. Instead, humanity, in contrast with the sea and the skylark who remain too old to end, has become frail, meaning weak, due to its corruption, and oblivion, meaning forgetting God, meaning that it cannot withstand the time scale of nature. In a moment of bleak reality, Hopkins loses his faith in humanity's restoration to God, seeing alienation as absolute, means complete and final, and a regression, means deterioration to dust and slime, as inevitable. This is what happens to us when we die. Gerard Manley Hopkins was inspired by the charm and interest of Wales, meaning the inscape and interest are complementary concepts about individuality and uniqueness derived by G.M. Hopkins. Ultimately, the interest of inscape leads one to Christ, for the individual identity of any object is the stamp of divine creation on it, and also by the Welsh poetic device known as sing-handed. In Welsh language poetry, sing-handed literally means harmony, which is the basic concept of sound arrangement within one line, using stress, alliteration, and rhyme. In 1877, the year of his ordination into Catholicism, he wrote a number of groundbreaking, almost ode-like sonnets, among them this week's poem, The Sea and the Skylark. Spatial and sensory location are important at the start of the octet. The speaker is standing on or besides the beach at Rhyl, the seaside town in North Wales, where the sonnet's first draft was written. With a sense of double occasion, he hears the sea on his right and the lark's song rising from the meadowland on his left. The registering of these complex sounds requires 2 years, and from the diction all the range of polyphonic effects it can dispense, meaning give out. Arrestingly discordant word doubling in the first line, year and year, and on the homonym of two noises too old, is further complicated by the N echo across the line break, end trench. Used as an intransitive verb, trench is dramatic, and the dash enhanced caesura seems to increase the depth of the cut incised. The sea itself makes a divided noise as a flood or a fall, with the heavy, pebbly harshness of right tide ramps suggesting the incoming tide, and a gentler consonantal strand depicting the low lull off as the tide retreats. That the process is continuous and endless is beautifully conveyed in the present participle, frequenting. The sea and the moon are almost personified, but Hopkins challenges poetic convention as he flirts with it, weaving into two lines the oral complexity of a five-part fugue. Paired spondees help the internal rhymes sound out as the second quatrain begins. The lark's score is his song, visualized as a skein which uncoils in a process that combines the rash fresh and the repetitive in an endless intricate pattern, rewinded and new skeined. The movement of coiling and curling from a wild winch whirl being probably a noun here, is both free and controlled. And line 8 tells us not a note of this music is excessive or wasted. The description of the lark song in line 7 almost follows the pattern of the sign-headed grows, that is cross sign-headed, in crisps of curl off, wild winch whirl. Perhaps the lark himself is singing a version of sign-headed. The repeated W's which evoked languor, meaning laziness in line 4, while moon shall wear and wend, now contribute to the breathless energy. Hopkins looks downwards in the sestet, condemning human intrusion with a mix of frothily light and grittily heavy adjectives, shallow, frail, sordid, turbid, and evoking a miniature industrial revolution in the hard, angry, reductive rhymes of our make and making break are breaking. Generally, the rhythms are more regularly metrical than in the octet. The sea and the skylark embody nature's and God's moral challenge. They ring right out, the diminished, man-made present, right now coming back adverbially to contain both fully and correctively. Dust and slime represent spiritual degeneration. No doubt, they were also the visible byproducts of the construction work that changed Ryle from centuries-old fishing village to Victorian watering place. Even earlier in the sonnet, in words like trench and roar, these human efforts at creation are subliminally present. Redundant in its conscious argument, they nonetheless add further elemental sound effects to the tidal and melodic sign-headed of Hopkins' praise. Contrasted with man's last dust, man's first slime might be an image of regeneration rather than despair. Commentary. It is a regular Petrarchan sonnet rhyming ABBA, ABBA, CD, 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 with a clearly marked division between octave, that is, definition of octave is the 8-line stanza of a Petrarchan sonnet, always occupying the first 8 lines. It sometimes has a division halfway, creating 2 quatrains, meaning 2 stanzas of 4 lines each. It poses a problem or describes some single object or incident. And sestet. Sestet means the 6-line stanza of a Petrarchan sonnet, occupying the last 6 lines, sometimes divided into tercets or couplets. Tercets means a stanza of 3 lines, and a couplet is a stanza of 2 lines. It often resolves the problem posed in the octave or comments significantly on it, with unusually each section being again divided into half, into 2 quatrains or 2 tercets, as the case may be. The definition of tercet. A tercet is a 3-line unit of verse, usually forming part of a sestet. Sometimes it rhymes within itself, sometimes it has the same rhyme scheme as the following tercet. In the octave, Hopkins compares 2 ancient sounds, that of the sea and that of a songbird, the skylark, one of whose favorite haunts is the sand dunes. The first quatrain deals with the sea. Hopkins is walking along the shore near the North Wales town of Ryle, some 6 or 7 miles from the colleges. Ryle was then an up-and-coming tourist resort on account of its wide, sandy beach. Walking westwards, he would have the sea on his right hand. He remarks particularly on the contrasting sounds of the high and the low tide. In this poem, Hopkins compares the sound of the sea and the skylark to that of a human civilization. The sounds of the bird and ocean are natural and pure. He describes them beautifully as crisps of curl of wild winch whirl and a low lull of or all roar. On the other hand, he describes the sounds of the town as sordid and turbid. I think what he is getting at is that the sounds of nature, of the sea and skylark, are simple and pure, while the sounds of people in the town are complicated and dirty. While we see ourselves as life's pride and cared for crown, we are not nearly as beautiful as the sea and skylark. While they have retained all the beauty of nature, we are moving away from it. We have lost that cheer and charm of earth's past prime, and are instead moving towards man's last dust and slime. By considering ourselves above earth and nature and becoming complicated instead of hanging on to simplicity, we have lost the beauty that can be found in the sea and the skylark. With this, we end this session. We will continue more about the poem in the next session. Thank you.